Welcome back, 325ers. We are trudging on. We left off with the end of the War of 1812, which is where we will pick up with this lecture. And really what we're going to be looking at is the period between 1812 and the Civil War, essentially. And our main focus is really going to be Irish immigration, actually. That is going to be the dominant stream of peoples coming in during this time, but it's also going to be the dominant event in terms of immigration, reaction to immigration, and is really going to portend immigration after the Civil War and how Americans are going to begin to reconceptualize their position vis-a-vis immigration. The other part that we're going to look at before we actually get to Irish immigration is the expansion of democracy in the United States, as well as westward expansion. So if we were to take two things for this lecture, it's going to be westward expansion and it's going to be Irish immigration, in fact. So we talked last time about the end of the War of 1812 and the great consequences that the war itself had. First and foremost, the war is going to end really the threat of British involvement in the United States, in fact, French involvement in the United States. It's also going to eliminate, in most parts, the reality of an Indian Confederacy that can stem westward expansion. So one of the things that we're going to see after the War of 1812 is really a steady move westward for Americans, and that's a direct result of the war itself. In fact, just to give you an idea, after 1812, between 1812 and 1850, there will be 14 states, essentially: Louisiana, Indiana, Mississippi, Illinois, Alabama, Maine, Missouri, Arkansas, Michigan, Florida, Texas, Iowa, Wisconsin, and California. So it just gives you a preview, right, of what expansion is going to do, and really the steady stream of expansion after the war itself. Something else about the war is Americans are going to realize that they need more investment in manufacturing. They need more investment in industry. There had been this idea based on these Jeffersonian principles that the United States would be an agrarian empire. It would be a land of yeoman farmers. And what the British showed them during the War of 1812, and really leading up to the War of 1812, and the ineffectiveness of any embargo the United States tries to implement, is that the United States needs to create its own markets. And that'll actually be our next slide. Also, too, importantly, after the War of 1812, really till about the Civil War, I mean, there is going to be the war against Mexico, but that isn't going to have the same type of impact as, say, the War of 1812 or the Civil War itself. And so we're going to see this relatively extended period of peace, not just in the United States, but really across the Atlantic world. And so what we're going to see is the environment created for the development of the United States, for westward expansion, for the market revolution, and also the demand for people to come into the United States. And so between 1812 and 1850, what we're really seeing are these immense changes to American society, immense changes to what Americans think of as the United States, what they think of what is an American. That definition is going to change. It's going to be in flux as many different peoples are going to become a part of the United States during this period. So first and foremost, the market revolution, what is it? What does it do? Essentially what the market revolution is the creation of self-sustained markets. It's the rise of industry in the United States. This isn't to say that this hadn't been happening already, and it isn't to say that all of a sudden overnight the United States is going to become an industrialist society. In fact, it isn't until the 1890 census that more people in the United States are going to live in cities than live in the countryside. So farms are still going to be an important part of this, but what we're going to see are changes in consumption, changes in living, and changes in production. Prior to the rise of the market society, most American farmers, for example, really grew crops for sustenance. They grew enough crops to feed their family, and then what they had left over, they then took to the market. What we're going to see in the market revolution is the inverse of this. And instead of growing to feed a family, farmers are going to be growing exclusively for the market. Right? It's going to upend how they even conceive of their own farming, how they see themselves in connection with what they grow and what market they're going to take it to. Also, it's going to involve the United States in much larger international economies, such that when an economy goes down in London, it's going to affect the economy in the United States. Also, too, by building this up, the United States is going to need more labor. And this is where we're going to see a rise in immigration and a demand for labor, higher wages as a result of that. You're going to see prodigious expansion in the United States, something that you're not going to see in, say, other countries. And so that's going to be a big draw in terms of production. If you think of massive public works projects such as the Erie Canal, you're going to have the Transcontinental Railroad being built toward the end of this period. That's going to draw in many immigrants in terms of laborers, which is always also going to, of course, change the concept of American society. Now, as I should say, interrelated with the expansion of markets, because one thing that markets do, as we talked about before, is that they change conceptions of living, they also change patterns of living. So the society that had existed in, say, 1800, as you can see by this map, isn't going to be the same structure of the society that lives in 1830. And one of the places we're going to see that most is in terms of politics, specifically in terms of voting. So in 1800, you can look at the map here and you can see that the darker brown is restrictions on voting for property qualifications. You had to own so much property in order to be able to vote. Other places have taxpayer qualifications. More often than not, they're really high taxpayer qualifications, eliminating most of the population from actually voting. And you see only 2 states have universal white male suffrage. There's going to be a dramatic shift going towards 1830s. In fact, in the 1820s, you're going to see a rewriting of most states' constitutions. And what we're going to see is an expansion of the franchise. And that expansion is going to be largely directed to white men. So more people are, in fact, getting the right to vote, but it's really at the expense of women. It's at the expense of free blacks. Because for the first time, what you'll have codified is race as a defining feature of citizenship. Politics itself is in fact going to narrow in terms of who can participate. But for many European immigrants, this is a great expansion in democracy. It's a great expansion of what rights they had in their former societies versus what rights they could have in the United States. So while women are losing power and losing rights, Native peoples are losing power and losing rights, free blacks are losing power and losing rights, white men are being able to gain those rights at their expense. In fact, what we're going to see in this period is a direct linkage between democracy, citizenship, and whiteness. And so these debates over who is and who is not white are going to be centerpieces for immigration. Immigrants coming in, gaining access to citizenship, their whiteness or lack of whiteness is going to be one of the key features that is going to be discussed moving forward. Another thing that we're going to see, as connected with the expansion of white democracy, connected with the westward expansion of the United States, of Americans, are the forced migration of both Native peoples and African-American enslaved peoples. So we mentioned there is a direct connection between this idea of democracy and this idea of whiteness, this idea that only whites are capable of democracy. Indian removal is going to be a centerpiece of this period, this idea that natives do no longer have the right to the lands that they claim. In fact, the Cherokee Nation, which is typically the one nation pointed to in terms of Indian removal, although Indian removal is going to occur throughout the eastern seaboard. Numerous eastern tribes are going to be forcibly moved out of their former homelands into western, mostly modern day Oklahoma, which is actually known as Indian Territory. The Cherokee had actually begun to shift their own society to try and fit in the norms of the dominant white society. In fact, from Washington through Jefferson, into Madison, all the way into Jackson, which is where Indian removal occurs, with Van Buren actually carrying it out. There is a narrative that Native peoples could become Americans if they only adopt American ways. And by that, they really mean European ways, white ways. And so the Cherokee begin modeling their society after that. They form a constitution based directly on the U.S. Constitution. They create newspapers. They create a written language. They enforce slavery in many of their locations to the Cherokee are in the South, and so they're a part of that Southern culture. But regardless of what the Cherokee do to show their capability of citizenship, their capability of being in American society, all of that is ignored. There's even a Supreme Court ruling that protects the rights of the Cherokee, protects the rights of the Cherokee to that land. It is largely ignored, and the Cherokee are forcibly removed out of their ancestral homelands, along with many other tribes, especially in the Southeast. There's also some in the North as well. And this is directly connected to the domestic slave trade. Because essentially what we're going to see are the Native Americans forced out of the Southeast and enslaved peoples from the Upper South forced down into the Lower South. I think I mentioned this before, but to give you an idea of the magnitude of the domestic slave trade, between 1820 and 1860, an enslaved person is sold every 3.5 minutes, give or take. And as you can see here, this is what this picture is portraying, is actually the sale of enslaved peoples, including children, mothers, fathers. Families are ripped apart in order to populate these lands. And in fact, I have a map to indicate what we're looking at. So this is Indian removal. You can see the Cherokee in Alabama and Georgia, the Creek, the Seminole, the Chickasaw, and the Choctaw. There's also going to be migrations out of Illinois down into this. But importantly, we're going to focus on this region here and the movement of peoples out, because you'll see the domestic slave trade is just filling those lines in. So if we go back, these people are moving out, and we go forward, enslaved peoples are being forced in. So this is also an indication, one, right, of both migration, of expansion, but also of this continued negotiation over who is and who isn't included in American society. Native people are not included in American society. Enslaved peoples are not included in American society. And this is feeding into this growing and solidifying idea that we know is manifest destiny. So ironically, manifest destiny originates as an ideology that says the United States is going to expand. The United States is going to be successful because of its institutions, because it's founded on republicanism, because it's founded on free institutions. There isn't a coercion, at least at the theoretical level, in terms of citizenship, in terms of being an American citizen, in terms of being an American. Of course, that is largely ignoring the role of enslaved peoples in this. But this idea that America would naturally expand because more and more people would demand these free institutions, that they would demand democracy. What we're seeing in this specific period, in this period after the War of 1812 up to the Civil War, is an expansion of a specific strain of manifest destiny, one that is intimately connected to what we know as Anglo-Saxonism. Anglo-Saxonism in and of itself is an incredibly loose term. This dates back to Teutonic tribes in England and Northern Europe. These kind of roaming bands of peoples that the English, for example, try to trace their ancestry back to. Americans are going to do much of the same thing. There's this connection between the freedom of these Germanic, these Teutonic tribes, and the freedom of American citizens. But this strain is going to be intimately connected again with whiteness and this idea of a white people who are bringing civilization to others. And it's also going to be deeply connected with Protestantism. One of the other things we're going to see in terms of expansions during this period is an expansion of the Protestant faith. This is loosely known as the Second Great Awakening, but you're going to see an explosion of revivals, an explosion of people going to church, people being connected with different Protestant faiths. And all of this is pushing this idea now that not only is America going to naturally expand, but America has to expand. America is destined to expand, and that the Anglo-Saxon race is destined to control all of the United States. This is a famous painting of Manifest Destiny. And you see here, this is the Angel of Progress, literally carrying a telegraph line. She's being followed by the railroad, being followed by farming, and who's being moved off, right? The buffalo, native peoples, wild animals. What you see here is a line, almost of demarcation between civilized and uncivilized. That Americans are bringing this type of life to these Western lands and in pushing off anyone that is going to stop progress, anyone that is going to stop expansion. And so this idea of Western expansion, this notion that America is destined to expand, is also intimately connected with warfare. We see the use of power against native peoples, the use of power against enslaved peoples, forcibly moving them to the lower south. And we're also going to see the larger state institutions, the federal institutions in terms of the army also waging war in terms of gaining land. We don't need to get into the details of the war against Mexico, but we can point out that the central piece of that war is expansion. The central piece of that war is this idea of expanding the United States to the Pacific coast, right? Now, after the United States really secures victory, they begin to negotiate a territory. One of the things they have to deal with are all of the peoples that live in the Mexican Cession. The Mexican Cession is a significant piece of land. It's going to increase the size of the United States by 1/4. But there's also a number of peoples that live in here. Native peoples, blacks, and of course, Mexicans. Now, in the lead up to the war and the arguments over the war itself, there's actually great concern about what the incorporation of these peoples are going to do, which is somewhat ironic because if you remember back to our previous lectures, one of the things that has been a hallmark of the United States is its multiplicity, is the number of peoples that have been in the United States, that have been a part of the United States from the beginning. But that diversity, that multiplicity is largely written out. And specifically at this time, as we see the rise of whiteness as a defining feature, the threat of incorporating so many people of different backgrounds, cultures, and ideas is going to be a major threat for American policymakers. And there's real concern about the incorporation of Mexicans from the Mexican Cession. Now, the treaty that's signed, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, actually protects the rights of the people that live in the Mexican Cession. They essentially have the choice of declaring themselves as Mexican citizens, but if they don't, and they stay within the new boundaries of the United States, they are automatically going to become American citizens. However, by and large, this does not happen. This provision of the treaty is more or less ignored by the United States. And in fact, what happens is that many of these places in the Mexican Cession do not become states for quite some time, because if you remember back, statehood equals equality. That if people are citizens of a state and that are citizens of a territory, that territory becomes a state, those people have equal rights before the law, equal rights as any other American would. And so because of the high proportion of Mexicans that are in the cession, many of these places do not become states. California is an exception because there is a flood of white settlement as a result of the gold rush. The typical scenario is actually Arizona and New Mexico are great examples of this. Even though they are acquired in 1848 with the treaty, 1850, you have the Compromise of 1850, which is setting in motion new plans for expansion. Arizona and New Mexico are going to remain territories until 1912. They do not become states until 1912 because there aren't enough white settlers there to make Congress comfortable to grant statehood. Now, we move to the largest section of our lecture. And really, the reason for this is, as I mentioned, it's the greatest influx of immigrants during this period, right? So interestingly, we have expansion, which is bringing in new people, but then we have the more kind of classic type of immigration that we think of. People coming across the Atlantic or Pacific, immigrating into the United States. And for this is a particular type of immigration. So the Irish have actually been immigrating since the colonial period, in fact. And so Irish immigration in and of itself is not new. What is new in this is the type of immigrants coming in and the number. As I mentioned, there is an influx of Irish. To give you an idea, from 1946 to 1855, over 1 million Irish people leave Ireland. And many of those are coming to the United States. And importantly, 90% of the famine Irish are Catholic. Now, what is interesting about the famine migration is the type of immigrant it creates. In Ireland, many of the people are wholly dependent upon the potato. To give you an idea of the 8 million residents in Ireland at this time, 3 million ate potatoes for every meal, and many of those only ate potatoes. So when the potato blight occurs, it wipes out their food source. And this is what we'd call, a push migration. There's little choice for them to stay there. They have to seek out new lines, and the United States is the preferred destination for most of those immigrants. Interestingly, many of those consider themselves exiles from Ireland. They believe that at some point they'll be able to get back to Ireland, that they're only sojourners in the United States and are just working their way to get back to Ireland. The fact of the matter is that for most of them, they never make it back to Ireland, and instead become a central part of many American cities, right? One of the things that the famine immigration does, and the kind of general picture of the famine immigrant, is poor and illiterate and Catholic. If there are three adjectives we were to put on these immigrants, it's poor, illiterate, and Catholic. So they don't have a lot of human capital. They don't have the ability to move out of the cities that they're moving into, which is why you see a lot of Irish in New York, which is why you see a lot of Irish in Boston. So another thing that the Irish are able to do then, because of their numbers, and because the Irish are in fact considered white. We'll get into the variations on this theme, but in general, the Irish are not denied voting. The Irish have the ability to vote, and as a result of this influx, they become a very important part of the Democratic Party. This is where we see Irish politics coming to the fore. The reasons that they largely become members of the Democratic Party is because in these cities, because they're so poor, the people that the Irish interact with on the daily basis, the people that they compete with for jobs, are African Americans in those cities. And the Democratic Party has a national platform of protecting slavery, of keeping African Americans regardless of their status, whether enslaved or free, at the lowest rung of the social ladder. And so the Irish support these policies because they want to be one step above African Americans. As long as they're one step above, then they're not on the bottom. In fact, the Irish are using their whiteness as a way to climb the social ladder. Now, because we have this influx of Irish, because these Irish are so different from the Irish that had come before. Many of the Irish coming before are in fact Protestant. Many of the Irish coming before are middling to well off. They certainly have enough social capital and human capital that they're not seen as leeching from the system, whereas these famine Irish simply don't have those means. And so what we see in reaction to this, and this is a consequence of this period of peace, where Americans are beginning to, again, reconceptualize what they think. We see the rise of nativism. And in fact, nativist is a definition formed during this time, formed in 1840, actually. We've seen this strain ever since the creation of the United States, but essentially what this is pointing to is the idea that there is a native stock in America, and that native stock needs preference over any other group. And so, in fact, a kind of general definition is nativism is an intense opposition to an internal minority on the grounds of its foreign connection. And this is where the Irish come in, right? It's the belief that these groups can never fully become American. This sense that there's something, really their foreign connection, that is going to prevent them from ever embracing pure Americanness. And we're going to see this thread occur really from this moment on. This idea that somehow people that came just a generation before are inherently better than the people that are just coming now. And there is, especially at this time, a general appeal. As I mentioned, this is a much different type of immigration when we consider the Irish. So there is that genuine fear of the Irish being unable to assimilate into American society. Also, too, during this time is a period of great political upheaval. We see the fall of the second party system. So the Whigs go away as a party. There's going to be a vacuum in terms of political participation. And so the nativists and this emphasis on immigration also distract from the overwhelming issue of the period, which is slavery and what to do about slavery. So nativism is kind of this secondary issue that takes people's minds off the great issue of slavery. And so what do we see in this period? We see the emergence of a political party. Now, the political party is officially known as the American Party. You're actually reading some of their political platforms, but they are largely known as the Know-Nothings. And where this comes from is allegedly anytime that someone asked about the American Party, the person asked said, "I know nothing." And so as kind of a joke, someone deemed them the Know-Nothings, and they took this as a badge of honor, and it became kind of shorthand for the American Party. Now, what does the American Party believe in? They form roughly in about 1854. Their large focus is on preventing immigrant influence in politics, and specifically this famine immigration. This is in direct reaction to the famine immigration, and specifically to the Catholicism of these Irish immigrants. Members of the Know-Nothings, the American Party, believe that because these immigrants are Catholic, they will never be able to rescind their affiliation with the Pope, that the Pope will always come before the country. You can even see here in this cartoon, right, that these different priests are coming on to U.S. shores and trying to attack the United States. This is young America and Brother Jonathan that they're trying to attack. And so the Know-Nothings, excuse me, set themselves against, one, the Democratic Party. They see the influence of the Irish in this kind of block voting of Irish immigrants for the Democratic Party as indication of the threat that the Irish possess. Because if the Irish are able to gain enough representation, if the Irish are able to gain enough votes and political power, who knows? Catholicism could become the national religion. This is a fear of the American Party. And so their platform and their focus is really anti-Catholicism and extending naturalization. So they extend naturalization by 14 years. They want oaths to be a part of any political office, that you have to take an oath to be a political office. And really what they want are to stop Catholics from running for office. They want to extend naturalization to prevent Irish immigrants from becoming citizens too quickly in order to kind of prevent the tide that they feel are coming. Now, interestingly, these know-nothings, these nativists, are also largely anti-slavery advocates, right? So this is something specific about this type of immigration. This isn't kind of just widespread oppression or widespread bigotedness in terms of what they believe in terms of politics. But they see a particular threat with the Catholic Irish and a particular threat to the political systems of the United States. And so what we see then with nativism and with this kind of push, right, is that there is a specific idea of who is and who is not American. And that is directly tied in with this expansion of democracy. That the expansion of democracy becomes white and male. For most nativists specifically, so does any immigrant. If an immigrant is to become an American citizen, they need to be white. One of the things that the know-nothings challenge about the Irish is their whiteness, right? There is question not whether the Irish are white, but whether or not they're white enough, right? Because when you connect voting, you connect participation so directly to this idea of whiteness, then you need to start defining what is and what is not white. It's no longer this kind of general idea of what people are, what they look like, because so much comes with it. Participation in American society, inclusion and exclusion. We can see what exclusion means with Native Americans, with enslaved peoples. And so the Irish don't want to give up their whiteness either. They're going to bank on this whiteness. Now, for the know-nothings, their movement is largely going to collapse, really under the weight of the Civil War. Slavery is just going to overwhelm nearly every other issue at this time. But that thread of nativism, that thread of opposition to someone seen as unassimilable, right? One of the things that the know-nothings are unable to do is get widespread support. They actually are quite successful in many sections of the country, particularly Massachusetts, for example, but they don't have national appeal. But their ideas certainly do have national appeal. At this time, though, it's just not enough to sway groups one way or the other. And this is going to lead into the Civil War. One of the things that the Civil War is largely going to kind of break our class, but also kind of break these periods of immigration. You're going to have very little immigration during the Civil War, but it's also going to be, again, a reconceptualization of the American citizens, because you're going to have the abolishment of slavery. You're going to have a massive new population of citizens, of freed peoples, of freed blacks in the South. Many of them are going to also migrate to the North. And so again, there's going to be a reconceptualization of now what do we do in terms of who is and who is not an American. So our conclusions. Westward expansion is still a dominant form of, we wouldn't necessarily call it immigration, but the incorporation of new and different peoples, right? There's this idea that manifest destiny is a influence of Anglo-Saxonism, when the reality, though, is that the groups being brought into the United States in large measure from westward expansion are not Anglo-Saxon. In fact, westward expansion is only going to increase the diversity of the United States, and is going to cause more consternation for those people who are trying to articulate a very specific Anglo-Saxon identity. Irish immigration presented a new and different problem. In terms of scale, you have a great number of Irish immigrants all coming at one time, and they're different. It's a different type of immigration. They're Catholic and they're poor and they're illiterate. And so there's going to be a great reaction in response to that. And that's what we see with the rise of nativists. They have little success, but they revealed the appeal of the arguments. This idea that native citizens should be protected before any immigrants coming in. And the connection between whiteness and democracy placed a growing emphasis on race. And what we're going to see after the Civil War is race is going to emerge as the defining feature of not just citizenship, but with how Americans think about immigration.